Putin should be arrested in the USA, Alaska, when he gets there. The International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest back in 2023 for ordering the abduction or theft of thousands of children from Ukraine, which were then sold to single Russian or childless Russian couples. And that is but one war crime. I expect to see him indicted for the use of chemical weapons, which we've discussed.
Hello and welcome to Byline Frontline. And it's a huge week ahead for Ukraine, Russia and Europe. For the first time in over a decade, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, is flying to US soil, to Alaska, to meet Donald Trump. It's been billed as another diplomatic push, but it's a victory for Putin to land in America anyway. He's not flying over anywhere else he can get shot down. And so far, all the meetings, all the discussions between the US and Russia seem to have gone nowhere. Trump seems to have lost his temper and then stepped back, announcing deadlines. And all the time, they seem to exclude Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainians from any discussion, of course, the Europeans. And Ukraine is in Europe, Donald. So the Ukrainians and the Europeans have slammed this later meeting. Is it Putin just playing another game or trying to legitimize himself? And of course, since the Russians have laid claim to Alaska, it's a great propaganda victory for the Russian nationalists. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Hamish de Breton-Gordon, experienced military man in the British Army and in NATO. And he's just written a piece for The Telegraph, which suggests, according to international law, that Vladimir Putin should be arrested as soon as he sets foot on American soil. Hamish, thanks for joining us. Now, it's been a while since we spoke, I think a few months. And in that time, the last 3 months, there have been rumors of deals, of Trump putting sanctions on Russia, giving him deadlines, which he then changes, outlines that he then ignores. But what's been the result of it? It's been a massive escalation in drone attacks, I've read, and in civilian carnage.
Well, absolutely. I mean, certainly when we look at what Russia's been up to, as you say, in the last few months, the increase in drone and missile attacks into Ukraine has been huge. Usually about 500 missile and drone attacks per night. And most of this is aimed at civilian areas, the main cities, particularly focusing on infrastructure, civilian buildings, but also, hospitals as well. And that really, once Trump started threatening sanctions, you sort of got the feeling that Putin was, chucking all that he could in the anticipation that actually he might be forced into some sort of deal. And of course, we'll come on to that. Conversely, on the front line, the contact line, very little has changed. There's been very little movement over the last few months. There's been a few successes here, there and everywhere. Russia is trying to paint a rather better picture than it was. I think Russia's trying to give the impression that they're winning, but I think it's really important people understand that they're not winning and Ukraine's not losing. And in the same time, Ukraine has been conducting a lot of what one would call strategically important attacks into Russia. Apparently, over the weekend, they've now reduced Russia's oil refining capacity by 17%, which is huge, especially when Russia gets all its foreign currency that keeps its war machine going. Allied to that, some of the Ukrainian attacks on some of the factories, we discussed in the past about Operation Spider's Web, but there's been a few other attacks on strategic targets. And the final bit to say on this, Peter, is the cyber. Only in the last few weeks, it would appear that Ukrainian Secret Service cyber specialists have attacked Aeroflot, and Russians are pretty hacked off that they can't go to their favourite beaches in the Mediterranean now. They are disrupted on a daily basis, flying to Sochi and other sort of beach resorts because of the interdiction of the cyber attacks onto Aeroflot, but also the drone attacks, which are often focused at regional airports that stop them flying too. So on the one hand, you seem to have a fairly heavy-handed, heavy-fisted approach by Putin to attack civilians, which is what he does and what I saw personally in Syria. But on the other side, actually, Ukraine's been doing some pretty impressive deep strikes that will be really hurting the Russians. And the longer it goes on, the longer it will hurt them. And this is now all building up, I suppose, to the meeting with Trump and Putin later this week.
Yes, before we get to that meeting, there were rumors, weren't there, of a big summer offensive. We see the impacts of the war stretching into its fourth year on the Russian economy, sort of bank problems. We see inflation, and that's before feeding through all these depletion of their oil capacities and refining capacities. So in a way, I mean, looking back on this, Hamish, you can see that whether he was engaged in we know Putin wanted Trump to win the presidency. This feels more last gasp to me for the Russians than it does for the Ukrainians, who have, let's not forget, half the country was invaded and they pushed them back. There were incremental changes on the front line. This huge summer offensive, which should be started or over by now, doesn't seem to have materialized. And instead, Putin seems to be resorting to, as you say, as you learned bitterly in Syria, attacks on civilians. Now, in Syria, obviously, those civilians are mainly defenseless. The Ukrainians aren't defenseless. This doesn't make Ukrainians more likely to sue for peace, does it? It makes them more resilient, as perhaps, the British discovered with their aerial bombing, at least on civilian morale in World War II.
Well, I think so, absolutely. And I think it's important that people are aware that the Great Summer Offensive has dribbled out, as it were. And I think if I would be much happier sat in Kyiv than I would be sat in Moscow, because apparently the Russians are still losing 1,000 people a day, and they're really having difficulty sort of replenishing the stocks. But then if you look from Kyiv's perspective, Europe has woken up. Now, whether that's because of Trump or whatever, actually, Europe has now woken up. Spending on defense is never been higher. And of course, the European NATO countries, militarily, they have first generation, they have modern equipment, modern capabilities, and on the whole, they're well trained. So as the longer this goes on, the more support Ukraine is going to get, particularly from Europe, and potentially also European militaries flexing their muscles. I mean, I've called recently that NATO should put a no-fly zone into civilian areas in Ukraine to stop civilians being attacked, which they could very easily do. Now, I'm not suggesting that is on the table, but I expect planning has been done. So as things move forward, so that one can see that there is an urgency from Putin, which is, although he doesn't want peace on any terms, because his initial aims of his special military operation were the complete subjugation of Ukraine, and he's a long way from that. And I think people in Russia are getting increasingly hacked off. You've mentioned the economy. Basic essentials, I understand, like potatoes, if you can get hold of them, are incredibly expensive. Now, the oligarchs might be untouched by this war, but the rank and file certainly aren't. And, the huge amount of casualties, over 1 million, and still going up, that really has an impact. So I think, there are real opportunities here. And you suggest, that Putin wanted Trump to win, and Putin seems to have some beguiling hold over Trump, God knows how or what, but we might be about to really find out. So, in a way, you can see that Putin really, really is keen on some sort of peace, but absolutely on his own terms. He has told us what those terms are at the moment, which is, the 5 oblasts all into Russian control, and Crimea also recognized as being part of Russia. Zelensky has said this is a long way from what the Ukraine people can accept. And I would agree. If I was Ukrainian, I would agree. So I think, there is probably a desire to keep on fighting, although I'm sure everybody wants a just peace for Ukraine. But actually, I think a bad deal is probably is probably worse than no deal at all.
Well, we saw what the bad deal was like, didn't we, in 2014, those Minsk Accords, which just merely delayed and gave Russia the kind of morale and sort of sense nothing would happen to them if they made a full invasion. We could be just on that same score. It may be worth, before we get to the summer, because I do think some of the understandings of Steve Witkoff, or however you say his name, there seems to have been a gross incompetency in the negotiations so far. But just on the European thing, in a way, the summit is in Alaska. It's on the far west coast of America on the Russian border. And that just shows how remote, in a way, that Trump is, and I'd say J.D. Vance, who's in the country at the moment, staying with our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, from the concerns of Europeans, because unlike America would not be next. But as we published a piece today on Byline Times by a Ukrainian academic, Andrei Chekhoin, that Europeans feel this because we'd be next. I mean, what he says is we have to stand up for Ukraine because if Putin rolls through Ukraine, he's going to roll through other European countries. And the Europeans have a completely different feeling and understanding about this issue.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that. And of course, Putin has told us that he will keep going. I mean, his overarching aim, his strategic aim is to redraw the borders back to the old USSR, Soviet Union times, which, does include several countries that are now members of NATO. And there's lots of musings recently about Latvia, whether Latvia was next. And certainly the Latvians believe that they will be next. So, yeah, I think from on this side of the pond, we see things very, very differently. And yeah, the location of the summit does seem a bit bizarre to be so far away from where the discussion is actually happening. It all seems to be psychologically completely devoid and disjointed from what is actually going on the ground, and isolated, no doubt, for a whole host of reasons. But yeah, I think we are in a very different position here. And Trump, and I think we must remember the Budapest Memorandum as well, which I know we've talked about it and it's always been aired. But at the end of the day, it was a treaty that guaranteed the borders of Ukraine, and it was signed by Russia and ourselves and the Americans, and we have failed that treaty. So, I mean, it really does put a whole host of other things in jeopardy as well. And when what Steve Witkoff, what perhaps Trump is suggesting and what Putin is suggesting really blows the memorandum, the Budapest Memorandum, completely out of the water. I mean, it's almost ignored, but it was such an important thing. And if the world can't trust the Americans and the Russians and ourselves, what can they trust? So I think it's is something important for Europe and probably so unimportant for Trump, and it is so important for Putin that actually only half the side of the argument is even going to be involved in the summit.
We should just explain to viewers that the Budapest Memorandum, 1991, I think it was, when Ukraine had a vote and declared its independence as many other former Soviet republics had done. Ukraine hosts a lot of the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union. In fact, Ukraine itself was a major manufacturer of weapons in the former Soviet Union. So that was for nuclear safety. They gave up their nuclear weapons in return for these peace guarantees. So that is, people have very short memories. So just going to the politics, the optics of this Alaska. Now, obviously, you and I know Trump's very moody. He could change his mind at any time. But, I mean, you alerted to some of the reasons it might be in Alaska. One is Putin is paranoid about assassination. And if he flew over any other airspace except Soviet airspace, I think he'd be rather fearful of getting shot down. Also, and it's on a lot of military insignia in Russia, they consider Alaska really to be part of the Soviet Union because I think the Americans bought it off the Russians in something like 1850.
Yeah, for a few dollars.
For a few dollars, yeah. And it's complete capitulation in terms of having this meeting without Zelensky. If that goes ahead, Trump's really behaving like Putin's poodle, isn't he?
Entirely. And I've just written a piece about this in the Telegraph. My suggestion is actually Putin should be arrested in the USA, Alaska, when he gets there. The International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest back in 2023 for ordering the abduction or theft of thousands of children from Ukraine, which were then sold to single Russian or childless Russian couples. And that is but one war crime. I expect to see him indicted for the use of chemical weapons, which we've discussed. And I, with others, hunted down the evidence that Assad was using chemical weapons in Syria. And if Assad ever does get under the coattails or out of the coattails of Putin in the Kremlin, the German government will arrest him for those crimes and other crimes as well. Yeah, it is a bizarre thing that this war criminal is going to be feted in and lauded in Alaska rather than arrested. And the fact that Zelensky's not there really, to me, makes it pretty meaningless because unless he agrees, Ben Wallace suggested over the weekend that Britain should be represented. And I agree with him. Sir Keir Starmer, Britain being another signatory of the Budapest Memorandum, should be over there and ensuring that that Trump doesn't do some dodgy deal with Putin in the absence of, in inverted commas, grown-ups in the room to make sure that it is fair and a just deal is done for Ukraine. But I'm sure it's chosen exactly for the reasons you said, that Trump probably won't allow American jets to shoot down Putin's aircraft, and anybody else is not likely to be in the area. So it's, and as you say, the Russians always thought Alaska, but Alaska is a good personification or euphemism, I think, for Russia itself. At the end of the day, they sold it for a few quid, and that's really what they're all about, and that's what Putin's all about. And sadly, doing deals is what Trump's all about. And let's hope that Trump doesn't sell Ukraine for a couple of dollars.
One of our front pages was, I think back in February, was that mob rule it was, with Trump sort of arguing with Macron and Zelensky. And obviously he thinks he can do an amazing deal, just backwards a bit on the International Criminal Court. As you said, there's an indictment out against Putin. America is not a signatory, but it doesn't. But many other countries are, including the UK. I think the UK and France. So Putin has very few places to go. So what do you expect? Just to unpack a little bit about the chaos and shambles around these negotiations. I think it's the Washington Post and the New York Times, one of those reported that Putin proposed that Ukraine should leave the semi-occupied districts. They've invaded a lot of them, but like Zaporizhzhia and the Kherson were in the southern sector. And Vitigov misheard it as that he would leave them. And so came back with this new plan. The Russians were prepared to retreat from these provinces they only semi-occupy. And there was no translator. There was no official translator. It was a Kremlin appointed translator. So you have no record. So we're not really in a position of great assurance about the competence of these negotiations, are we, Hamish?
Well, no, we're not. And I think that's one of the troubles with the Trump administration, and particularly with Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff, from what I understand, is a great real estate dealer like Trump. He's not a diplomat. He's not a qualified negotiator. If he speaks Russian, I'm sure he doesn't speak it to the level that is required to understand the nuances of all of this. And, you would have thought that actually Putin is running Witkoff, not Trump, which is just bizarre. And absolutely, the completely wrong message has got back. And I think these are highly skilled and challenging positions that people like Witkoff have been put into. I mean, you could even say the Defense Secretary Hesketh, who, was a soldier for a few weeks. I was a soldier for many, many years, but I don't suppose I'd make a brilliant Defense Secretary. But, at least I've got 37 years of experience behind it. So I think, it is really dangerous. And we know, whatever we think of Putin, he is a pretty shrewd negotiator. And the fact that he's still in position after 25 years, as a dictator and tyrant, shows that he probably has absolutely no scruples. And the amount of people who've opposed him, who've fallen off balconies or died. And of course, two opponents of his have been, one murdered, Litvinenko in this country, and Sergei Skripal was a failed assassination attempt. So,
the two actual official political people challenging Nemtsov and Navalny were both murdered.
Entirely. So completely ruthless. So you've got Putin on the one hand, and you've got some bloke who flogs houses on the other hand. I mean, you couldn't be further away. I know who I'd want negotiating on my behalf, and it wouldn't be Witkoff. So, I think we're in a challenge. Exactly the point you made earlier on. The trouble with Trump is he's so flighty. Today it's blue, and tomorrow the same color is red. I mean, there is just no consistency. And when you're dealing with such important things, you've got to be consistent, and you've got to be reliable, and you've got to be trusted. And I'm not sure those three epitaphs can be nailed solidly to Trump's character.
So two final questions, thoughts. Well, I think the next one is the fallout between Putin and Trump, this sort of sense from Medvedev, the slightly former president, former prime minister, who gets on Twitter along with Alexander Dugin and tweets out quite drunkenly, it seems. People allege, I don't know if he is drunk. And there was a big falling out, Dugin says he's mad, Medvedev says Trump's mad. Some people say this is all kabuki. It's just like Worldwide Wrestling Foundation. They're not really falling out. What do you think? My feeling is it's so chaotic, it could be both. It could be a great strategy to make you think that Trump's actually going to do a deal, pretending not to do a deal. He's going to sell pretending to be on Ukraine's side. On the other hand, he could just be so moody. He does hate Russia one day. What's your opinion on that? That kind of the optics, the emotionality of all that.
I think the amazing thing, Peter, is that we're having this discussion. We are talking about the President of the United States, the most powerful man on the planet with the most powerful military and 5,000 nuclear warheads. And we're talking about a discussion with somebody else who's got 5,000 odd nuclear warheads and somebody who is completely ruthless and has invaded a sovereign country, has been responsible for 1 million of his own casualties and probably several 100,000 of others. So, yeah, it is a bizarre position to be in. And if it wasn't so dangerous, it would be amusing, but it is just not. We saw, Trump, I praised him for what he did with the Iranians. And I think that attack was probably a good thing, has taken a bit of a heat out of the Middle East. But, quite frankly, on this side, the fact that none of us can call it and we don't know what's going to happen. And we've discussed before, it's one thing about buying and selling houses, but when there is blood and guts and people's lives in place, this is not a monetary discussion. This is not something that can be sorted by crossing palms with silver sort of thing, which you sort of get the impression Trump thinks it can be. I mean, certainly he appears to be bought by gold and baubles, and whether Putin can as well. I don't know. I'm afraid I'm just not very confident, but I do believe that Ukraine does have a chance, and I think people must understand that Ukraine is not losing and Russia is not winning. Because if you conclude that, then you would say that Zelensky's got to sue for any sort of peace, and I don't think that's the case. And I'm not confident that Trump is going to do a decent deal in Ukraine's favor at the moment.
Let's just finally look at the reasons why Trump seems to be in awe, let's put it that way, of Vladimir Putin. There are very many. Obviously, we had the Mueller investigation, the Senate Intelligence Services Committee looking at the pro-Trump information operations and influence operations. We also know that Trump had extensive business dealings to Senator Millian, Trump Tower, or the condominiums that were bought. And so, when people talk about compromat and embarrassing files, but, in a way, what you can say about Trump is he likes the money that came from Russia, and he rather likes the dictatorial way that Putin deals with his internal adversaries. Well, I'm just wondering if just a last thought, Hamish, that a lot of this is tied up with his troubles with the Jeffrey Epstein files. And he's done all kinds of things to distract away from those. And the timing of this is slightly suspicious, isn't it, when the front pages have been dominated. And we've investigated, by the way, Epstein's Russian connections, which are extensive. He clearly had two, let's say, highly educated Russian women from the senior diplomatic academy working for him. It seems to get into big tech. So, is your feeling all these moments, these deadlines have passed, it's 50 days, it's 30 days, it's 10 days. This is a lot of optics and hot air. And as you say, the reality is on the ground. Russian bogged down, only be able to make its civilian tax, its own civilian oil infrastructure coming under attack. This is what will matter this summer.
Well, I think let's see what happens on Friday, because you could come to the conclusion up to Friday that there is something in all of what you said that Trump doesn't want to be aired. The view that if he completely screws Putin, then Putin might well go, well, here's some pictures, here's all this money you owe me, etc., etc., etc. But the slight converse before I finish on this is Trump is so thick-skinned. Even if something miraculous did come out about his relationship with Putin or Russians or whatever, I think he would, brush it off anyway. He often says, the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, sort of thing. And one would expect the same there, unless it is something so devastating that it would likely cause the end of his reign. I think he would just brush it off. But I suppose the other thing is that, his negotiations with Putin put him on top of the world. He is on the front of every newspaper, every news channel, and people kowtow to him. and treat him like some sort of demigod, just in the hope that he'll do the right thing. And I think he loves that. And I don't think he wants to get off that pedestal. So, it might sound terrible to say it, but he'd probably want this to keep on going. So he's the top dog, rather than, if there is a peace in Ukraine, then he's going to have to sort out his own ailing economy and everything else. So, yeah, there's a lot to play for. Let us hope that he finds the moral, competent, decent man within him, which hopefully is there on Friday, rather than somebody who wants to play at being the sort of the world's general, as it were.
As you say, very astute. In a way, Trump's vanity may come to save us. He'll want to get that Nobel Peace Prize, and that may matter more to him than money. He's certainly got enough money. Hamish, thank you, as always, for your brilliant insight. We'll maybe check in at the end of this week or next week and see where we are on this roller coaster. Thank you so much for joining us on Byline Frontline.
Thanks very much for having me.
We wait with bated breath to see what happens at the summit this week. And if you want us to cover more of global conflict and what's happening in Ukraine, please do support us, either by subscribing to Byline TV or our regular monthly newspaper in all the shops. And this edition, as most of our Frontline editions are, is produced by Kaylin Robinson, who's done some amazing reports from Ukraine. And I'd suggest you follow his YouTube too. Thank you.